I often tell people I'm unapologetically Black and unashamedly Christian, but I'm also unapologetically American and unashamedly evangelical. American evangelicalism is one of my favorite topics. I often tell people I'm unapologetically Black and unashamedly Christian, but I'm also unapologetically American and unashamedly evangelical. And people wonder, well, how can you say you are evangelical with everything that's been happening in your country? We've seen, well, the recent president, who a lot of us are thankful is out of office. But then we're also seeing the continuation of the problems with the American evangelical tradition. And so my goal today is to answer 4 questions for you. And you can also ask me questions as we go along. This is kind of a spontaneous, free thing. And these 4 questions are going to be, first, what is American evangelicalism? Then, where did American evangelicalism come from? And the third question I'm going to answer is, what has happened to American evangelicalism? And then finally, I'm going to try to answer the question of where should American evangelicalism go? And so let's begin. First, what is American evangelicalism? Well, American evangelicalism is not a church or a denomination, and it is not a political party or a single group with one opinion. Instead, it is an ecumenical Protestant movement from the 18th century, and its membership is quite diverse and more than just conservatives. There are liberal evangelicals, such as President Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter, who believe in legalized abortions and gay marriage. And there are moderate evangelicals, such as Dr. Francis Collins, who leads the National Institute for Health in the United States and supports the teaching of evolution. The movement is also more than just whites and Europeans. And some of its founders and early leaders were men and women of color. Wow. So 2 examples of this are Lemuel Haynes. He was the first Black person to be ordained in the United States. He fought against England in our Revolutionary War, and he pastored all white Puritan congregations in the Eastern US. And the second example of a woman, sister, is Joanna Lee. She was the first woman licensed to preach in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She walked over 3,000 kilometers a year visiting different churches, and she preached 178 sermons in her time of ministry. So these are examples of men and women of color who were the founders of American evangelicalism, or some of the founders. Though American evangelicals are racially, politically, and theologically diverse, they all have one thing in common, or we all have one thing in common, and that is an emphasis on the gospel of Jesus. In fact, the word or the name evangelical comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news or gospel. And the early Protestants at the Reformation used this name during the Reformation period. They used it to distinguish themselves from the Catholics. If you read Zwingli or Calvin or Luther or Martin Bucer, you will see that they say there is the Catholic or the faith of Rome and the evangelical faith. So this goes back to the Reformation. And one could say that American evangelicalism is a Reformation movement. And like the early Protestants, its members have 4 beliefs in common. And these beliefs are: 1, being born again, and that is salvation through believing in the gospel of Jesus. The second is discipleship, and that is serving others and seeking justice through imitating Jesus. The third belief of evangelicalism is humble orthodoxy. I say humble orthodoxy, and that is serious theological reflection and faithfulness to the Bible. And then last is liberty, and that is that all Christians are free to choose their political, theological, and social views. You see, traditionally, you have this paradigm, as you know, of liberal, and then you have conservative. And what evangelicalism was an escape from that paradigm. So again, you can have a liberal evangelical, a moderate evangelical like me, or a conservative evangelical, or a fundamentalist evangelical. And they all disagree in theology and politics and everything else, but they hold in common these 4 things that I told you: being born again, discipleship, humble orthodoxy, and liberty. In summary, for the first question, American evangelicalism is a diverse ecumenical Protestant movement that seeks to be gospel-centered in faith and practice. So that's my answer to the first question, and that is, what is American evangelicalism? And before we continue to the second question, are there any questions you have? Is all clear? Yes.
What are they free to choose? You said they postulate the freedom to choose
Politics, their political views, social views, and theological views. Yep, and you can ask in German now. Yes? No, they're the same thing. And it's funny because it's like hearing this, when I came to Switzerland, they were like, oh, he is evangelical, leave him alone. Or she is evangelical, but we are evangelisch, reformierte people. And I would say, but that's like saying chai, tea. It's the same thing. Chai means tea. It's the exact same thing, you know. And so there's been this weird distinction that happens in the Germanic-speaking world. And Dr. Opitz had told me that this came at the time when Billy Graham had come to Switzerland. And if you were for Billy Graham, the evangelical, you were evangelical. But if you were classic Reformiert or classic Protestant, you were evangelisch. And you see this distinction also, this is happening now in the US with churches that came from a German-speaking background. So we have Lutheran churches, and some of them still have German services. And they were proud evangelicals in the 80s and the 90s. And now they will say, no, we are evangelisch. And you're like, okay, but it's the same thing. So yes, I hope that answers your question. Okay. Anyone else? All right, going once, going twice, moving on. So the second question I want to answer for you is, where did American evangelicalism come from? And now I'm going to hit you with a lot of history. Well, before the War of Independence in 1765, the United States was a series of European colonies. And these colonies had established churches, or Landeskirchen, like their mother countries in Europe. And they also had free churches that had immigrated to the colonies to escape persecution in Europe. And these would be groups like the Quakers and the Baptists and the Mennonites. Over time, the colonial churches started to get very formal, and they became disconnected from society. And you started seeing a repeat of the situation with the old churches of Europe. You had it to where, in many cases, the rich would go to the high Protestant churches, and then the poor people would be left to go to these sort of free church communities. And so what happens is that there was a group of pastors who said the churches have lost their focus and mission. And this was in the Protestant colonies. And they also said these churches have become disconnected from the emphasis of the Protestant Reformation, which is the gospel. Because you started hearing people saying, well, I do good works, and so I can get to heaven through my church services and being nice to people. And this caused a controversy amongst some Protestant pastors, because they said, well, this is reversing the Reformation, because the Reformation was solus Christus, sola fides, sola scriptura. It was salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And so these Protestant pastors who were concerned, they began to work together for spiritual renewal. Some of these pastors had also been sent by missions from the old churches of Europe. So they were missionaries in the colonies. And they represented 4 traditions of renewal. And these traditions are Pietism, Presbyterianism, Puritanism, and High Anglicanism. And so Pietism, or Pietism, it's a Lutheran tradition from Germany, which came from the theologian Philip Spener in the 17th century. It taught that faith should be warm and personal, and that God should be worshiped with joy and celebration. The second tradition, Presbyterianism, is my tradition. It's a Reformed tradition from Scotland, which came from John Knox, who actually studied under John Calvin in Geneva. It taught that Christians should balance faith and reason, very good Reformed thinking, and that God should be worshiped not just with the heart, but with the mind. The third tradition, Puritanism, this is a Reformed tradition from England, which came from English Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries. The first American colony, Jamestown, Virginia, was founded by Puritans who taught that people should examine their faith and have a conversion experience to join the church. And then lastly is High Anglicanism. And this is a Protestant tradition from England that, if you know the story, it comes from King Henry VIII wanted to get divorced. So he broke with the Church of Rome and started his own church, the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And Anglicanism, it taught that churches should be flexible in membership and innovative in organization and outreach. Well, as pastors in the colonies worked for spiritual renewal, they brought these 4 traditions together, and they started a revival that we call the Great Awakening. This revival went from 1730 to 1755. And it had large gatherings where people would sing and pray with joy. They would listen to long, emotional, and logical sermons. They would cry about their sins, and they committed to personal holiness and public service to society. In response to this revival, it woke up. This is why it's called the Great Awakening. It woke up a lot of the colonial churches, and it connected them with society again. And it also got pastors addressing social problems and working to correct them. One of the biggest problems in the colonies was alcoholism. At that time, the average person drank 3 times the amount that people do today. Wow. And so out of love and support for those who suffered from alcoholism, you started seeing Christians give up alcohol You started seeing kind of a temperance movement. You started seeing churches to say, we're not going to create problems for these people. Out of love and support, we won't drink. And we'll create spaces where they're not tempted and hurt. Christians also built schools. They started charities, and they worked to improve things like healthcare. In addition to the Great Awakening, the colonial pastors' work gave birth to American evangelicalism. And when you look at evangelicalism, you can see these four traditions. How many of you visited an American evangelical church or an evangelical church here in Switzerland? Okay, then you will understand, you'll say amen to everything that I'm about to show you. You can see these four traditions if you go to an evangelical church. So for example, when you go there, people will seem happy. There'll be this emphasis on joy and happy songs. And this comes from German pietism or pietism, with this warm spirituality. On the websites of these churches, there will usually be a statement of faith, what we believe. And there'll be articles about what does the Bible say about this? And what does the Bible say about that? That is Scottish Presbyterianism, with its call for deep theological reflection and worship with the mind. During the service, there will be also a chance, usually at the end of the service, the pastor will give the invitation, and they'll be playing soft music for you to come forward and give your life to Jesus, to get saved. This is English Puritanism, with its focus on conversion. And then you'll also find in these churches a simple process to join. In many evangelical churches, you can just show up and you're in. It's not like our Landeskirchen where you have to go to the Rathaus or to the town hall and then say, I'm a Protestant, and fill out all this paperwork. You can just, with evangelical churches, walk in and be a member. And this is high Anglicanism with its flexibility and its innovation. Another thing that one will see in American evangelical churches is people raising their hands in worship. Have you seen this? And this actually comes from John Calvin, believe it or not, and the Reformed Church of Geneva. When praying, the early Calvinists would lift their hands to heaven. There's actually a letter where John Calvin is telling someone who says, I get bored during the services and my mind wanders. What do I do? And he says, well, when you pray, lift your hands. And so the early Calvinists would lift their hands to heaven. And this was also done by the Puritans in services and their family prayers. Lifting hands was a symbol of surrender to God and being open to his will and receive his grace and forgiveness. So when modern evangelicals lift their hands, it's not something weird that they made up. It's an old form of Protestant prayer that goes back to the Reformation. In conclusion, American evangelicalism comes from these four European traditions: Pietism, Presbyterianism, Puritanism, and Anglicanism. And these traditions were brought together as a way to renew the colonial churches. So that's my answer to the second question. Are there any questions or comments that you might have? Yes.
Would be rather Armenian.
Yes. And yeah. And it's interesting because usually revivals, when you hear it here in Switzerland, it starts with churches like the Mennonites or the Pentecostals or the Baptists. But the Great Awakening started with Reformed Christians. And then those who are Freikirche today, they joined in. It started with Reformed Anglicans and Puritans, Reformed English Christians, and Methodists. And then Quakers and Baptists and other groups started joining in. So it's quite interesting. In that day, the revival was the other way around. It was us Reformed people that started off. And we have a joke about Presbyterians in the US, or Reformed people. They call us the frozen chosen. But the Great Awakening, you would have thought that you were in a Pentecostal church. People were falling out over the floor. People were crying. People were shaking. They had different names for these emotional responses. How many of you know of Jonathan Edwards, the famous American theologian who wrote the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? Well, as he's preaching this sermon, he's holding the manuscript to his face and he's preaching it monotone, like a typical Reformed pastor. And as he's just reading, people are falling out on the floor. People are crawling under the pews. People are like, it was very emotional. And you have this guy reading monotone about people going to hell. So the Great Awakening, it's quite interesting. It was the Reformed people mostly that started this. And it got emotional. So there was a point where we weren't the frozen chosen. Yeah. So any other questions or comments? Yes?
Just about Knox. I think he also had contact to Bulling.
Yes, he did.
Yes, I remember that from the history we have in.
He did.
And also this, yes, I think the Queen of 7 Days or something like
Jane
that.
Grey.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there was also because Presbyterian, I thought it could be when I got it translated, it's Reformiert.
Yes, it's
And
Reformiert.
also it's also in connection with Zwingli and with Bullingen, and Calvin is one generation later on, maybe parallel to Bullingen.
Yes. So
But there was also a connection to Zurich, I think.
yes, there was. So what happened is, this is a little side history. John Knox, the founder of our Presbyterian church, we call him the Thundering Scot because he was very emotional and he thundered from the pulpit. Well, he goes to Geneva and he likes it there, and he's pastoring this like refugee community. And then Calvin tells them, you came here to learn and to take what you learned here back to your homeland. So Calvin was like, you need to leave. And John Knox was like, no, I want to stay. And so Calvin kicked him out, sent him from Geneva. And so in protest, John Knox came to Bullingen here in Zürich to say, you know, I've been kicked out of Geneva, it's not fair. And then Bullingen says, you know, Bullingen plays the neutral Swiss and says, you know, I don't know what you're talking about. This has nothing to do with me. I'll pray for you, but perhaps you should go home. And so the rejection from Bullingen is part of the reason the Presbyterian Church was born. Knox goes back to Scotland. The other thing is, and this is another side note, is that for many years I think in the U.S., but also in the British Navy, the American British Navy, one of the books that they had on board was the sermons of Heinrich Bullingen. So there's this deep connection to Switzerland. Yes. Welcome. Anyone else?
You had mentioned the Pentecostals, and I was wondering would you consider them a part of evangelicalism, or would you say that would you distinguish between the two?
They are a part of it because they come out of, so there was more than one Great Awakening. So there's the first Great Awakening, and this is in the colonial period. Then there was the second Great Awakening, and this was led by the Methodists mainly. And then you had out of that awakening something called the Holiness Movement. Sorry if I'm taking from your other lectures. Yeah, okay, if this will come up. Yeah. So you had the Holiness Movement, and what this was the Methodist Church. You had Methodists who said they were remembering those old camp meetings, as we called them, and the gatherings of the first Great Awakening and other revivals, and they wanted to recapture their love for Jesus. So they would get together in these kind of house groups, and they would read the words of John Wesley, and they would sing and pray together. And out of this came the holiness movement. And then out of the holiness movement later comes the Pentecostals. So the Pentecostalism is birthed out of American evangelicalism. Anyone else? Okay, going once, going twice, moving on. Now we're going to get to the question that probably has been eating at all of your hearts. And that is, what has happened to American evangelicalism? So now we're going to talk about Trump. Well, in November of 2016, we were all shocked to see Donald Trump become president of the United States. And the group that gave him the greatest support identified as evangelical. Many asked how such people could endorse Donald Trump for office when he did not even match the heart of this historic Christian movement. Though he is German and Scottish, his mother was from Scotland, his father is all German. Though he's German and Scottish, he lacked the warm faith of Pietism and the deep theological reflection that is found in Presbyterianism. And despite him claiming the Puritans as his ancestors, and that was weird because it's like, your family came to America in the 20th century. The Puritans were, 16th, 17th, 18th century. Your family wasn't there at that point. Though he claims the Puritans as his ancestors, he lacked their self-examination and emphasis on conversion. And one could say that he might have had the marks of high Anglicanism, but his innovation and organization were meant for different purposes. Donald Trump did not match up with American evangelicalism in general. It didn't make sense. And this made a lot of people wonder, what happened to the movement? How did this movement get to this point? Furthermore, after the Washington riots earlier this year, many people wondered, how did evangelicalism go from leaders like Lemuel Haynes and Jerena Lee to a shaman on Capitol Hill with horns on his head? How did it happen? Well, the majority of Trump-supporting evangelicals were white Americans. And this has to be considered when you think about what has happened. It's also important to remember that there are different types of white evangelicals. I want to emphasize that point. There are liberal and moderate white evangelicals. And most who endorsed Donald Trump identified as conservative. And one last thing to consider is that not all conservative evangelicals supported Donald Trump. And one of them is Russell Moore. And he was the theologian of ethics for the Southern Baptist Convention. So a better question to ask is, what happened to parts of conservative white evangelicalism? And the answer lies in 1976 with the election of Jimmy Carter. You see, before the 1970s, American evangelicals were not politically organized. And many were not even registered to vote. And they saw politics as a dirty business. For them, what was most important was bringing people to Jesus. And they had no tradition of racial justice like the liberal mainline or the old Protestant churches. This is why white evangelicals, when the civil rights movement happened, they said very little. And sometimes they were critical of it because they were seeing it as Martin Luther King Jr. and all these people are being political, and they couldn't see racial justice from their perspective in the Bible. So they said little to nothing, or they were critical of the civil rights. And just like the Great Awakening, their focus at that time was on conversions. And they believed that when people came to Jesus and started imitating him, then this would reform society. So you'll hear among evangelicals, why does the government have to get involved? We can depend on the churches to do it. This thinking goes back to this Great Awakening idea that people imitate Jesus And the church can reform society through the imitation of Jesus. Just get people saved, and we all start doing what Jesus did, society will be better. So this is where the thinking comes from. Well, so they believed that society could be transformed through people getting saved. In short, white evangelicals, they had no vision or desire for political engagement. But all that changed when Jimmy Carter won the nomination as president. You see, Carter was an evangelical. He was the first evangelical president, actually. And he was from the Southern Baptist Convention. And he used evangelical language that the country had never heard of. People would ask him, what's behind your politics? And he'd say, my faith in Jesus Christ. And he would say, I'm born again. Most Americans didn't know what that meant. Only evangelicals did. He was the first one to bring that term mainstream, being born again. Suddenly, American evangelicalism found itself in the spotlight, the national spotlight. But it also found that its focus on the gospel at that point was not enough. You see, evangelicals would avoid divisions through their common salvation in Jesus. And when they would disagree, they would often say, well, it doesn't matter that you're a liberal or I'm a conservative. All that matters is that we are saved and know Jesus. That's how they would deal with disagreements. But when Carter becomes president, they realize it's not enough, because Carter, his liberal convictions, he's more of a liberal. And it's one thing when you have two Christians having a discussion about their convictions. It's another when a Christian is president and these convictions are creating policies that affect the country. So Carter believed in racial justice and legalized abortion. And he invited LGBTQ plus people to public discussions at the White House. And this disappointed a lot of conservative white evangelicals. And it brought about this sense of fear that made them get political. For many years, there had been this group of fundamentalist evangelicals that we call the religious right. And they believed that America was a Christian nation that had lost its way and needed to be saved. So in the 1960s and 70s, you started seeing all of these different social crises and problems. There was the AIDS virus had come on the scene, and it was becoming an epidemic. There was the desegregation of schools. There was the loss of prayer in public schools. And then there was the breakdown of American homes and families. These problems, along with the Carter presidency, had convinced evangelicals that their country was on a slippery slope. And it would take more than just conversions to get the country back on track and back to God. The religious right that I mentioned earlier believed that Christians had to get involved in government and elect politicians who could pass laws that were socially conservative. For white evangelicals disappointed by President Carter, the Christian right had the answer to save the soul of America, to keep the country from the slippery slope. The answer was by the religious right was an organization called the Moral Majority, a political organization called the Moral Majority. And it was founded by a fundamentalist evangelical named Jerry Falwell Sr. Upon joining the Moral Majority, white evangelicals entered what we call the culture war. And this is a conflict in the US between liberals and conservatives to dominate society, to dominate the values, beliefs, and practices of American life. Since the election of Jimmy Carter, white evangelicals have fought for dominance in the culture wars through politics. And they've lost sight of the original goal of their movement from the Great Awakening. Instead of seeking to renew the church and reform society through the good news of Jesus, white evangelicals, and I think, and some evangelicals of color, but these groups of evangelicals, have tried to gain political control to make a Christian nation that they're comfortable with. This loss of their original goal has made them vulnerable to demagogues and allowed them to fall for Trumpism and its promises of greatness. This is why, despite all of the issues that Donald Trump has, his language resonated with evangelicals. His promises of taking the country back, protecting Christianity, and restoring old glory. Another thing is that white nationals also found these promises appealing. And this has led to an unholy partnership between some conservative white evangelicals, not all, and white supremacist organizations. So this is my take on what's happened to American evangelicalism. Are there any questions or comments at this point? I know it was a lot. So just.
I would suggest that Roe was Wade.
That's another thing.
Major,
Yes.
because Christians realize our justice system is on a slippery slope. And so we need a conservative president who nominates judges that will bring back Christian values.
Yes.
And I think that determines until today.
Yeah, it does.
The choice that they finally have to make between the Democrat and the Republican.
Yes. Roe versus Wade, the debate over legalized abortion from the Supreme Court. This was the final straw for people under President Jimmy Carter. When this happened, there was one pastor that, he's a pastor, but he's a politician as well. And he was working with President Carter. And he goes down, and there was a group of evangelical pastors that were meeting at the White House. And he goes to them and says, "What did you think? What do you think of President Carter?" And they started saying, "Boo, he's a terrible man." And he was like, "What?" And they pointed, and then you realize the liberal and conservative paradigm has now come into evangelicalism. At the same time, just to speak positively, sorry that I'm pulling out my phone because there's an article, and you can look this up. There was a group in Chicago of evangelicals, and they started what was called Evangelicals for Social Action. And this was around 1973, before Carter becomes president, before he's elected. They wrote what's called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. So these were evangelicals who were saying, we need to find a way of political engagement. We need to think about these topics. It's not just enough to convert people to Christianity. We have to really think deeply about this. And so and I believe they were motivated by those founding traditions, Presbyterianism, Puritanism, and Pietism. They were motivated by those core traditions to really think in that dimension. I saw a hand here.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know if you're a political expert, but would you say that Jimmy Carter lost the election to Ronald Reagan on the grounds of not being electable for evangelicals?
Yes, these are some really good questions. Thank you. So I'll give you another bit of history, and that is that when people look at the U.S. at elections, it's always the North and the East Coast and West Coast is blue, and then the South is red. Before 1960, before the 70s, this wasn't the case. The Democrats, it's interesting, were the dominant party of the South. Most slave owners were Democrats. And the party for freedom was actually the Republicans. And then what happens is that at some point during the 20th century, early 20th century, there's this crossover. The Democrats decide that they want to get rid of this old image of being slave holders, and they want to be more progressive. So they embrace the civil rights movement. they become more liberal, more progressive. And you have these old Southern Democrats who felt betrayed by their party. They weren't welcomed anymore. And so they defect to the Republicans. There's this crossover. And so then the South becomes red. And this defection, this switch was happening, was coming to an end around the time of Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, when he, as a Democrat, when he showed that he was a liberal, that was the last straw for evangelicals. And so then the following election, they support the Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan. Anyone else? Yes?
Ja, einen kurzen Artikel gelesen, in dem man ja auch nachgelesen hat, wo auch erklärt wird, zu erklären versucht wird, wie das gekommen ist. Und dort wird gesagt, es ist die ganze Seite von den Republikanern aus den 60er Jahren nach der Aufwahl, nach der großen politischen Niederlage der Republikaner, haben die republikanischen politischen Strategen gemerkt, wenn wir die Evangelicals, die bisher eigentlich nicht politisch sind, wenn wir die für unsere Rechte gewinnen und also uns ganz bewusst konservativ platzieren und moral, dann haben wir die Evangelicals auf unserer Seite. Und seither sind die meisten Evangelicals republikanisch, egal was für ein Präsident das ist.
Yes, there was when you said this, it reminded me that there was actually an intentional takeover of the Republican Party by people in the moral majority. And some of the people who were part of that takeover are still living today. And so what they said is they said, the religious right, they said, we need to, because evangelicals, remember, they're not registered to vote, most of them. And so what does this make them? It makes them a huge untapped voter base. And so if we can get all of these people on board, then we can take over, we can take over the country. And so they said, which party, people from the religious right, which party is more easier for us to get into? Well, it's not the Democrats. Because of abortion. Jimmy Carter has tainted the Democrats. Yeah. So they decide to say, we have to go red. And you have all of these old Southern Democrats who are socially conservative as well. They're socially conservative. And so they're in the Republican Party, and these old Democrats, they have connections as well. So you think they have connections as well, that they have power in their communities. So the Republicans were the ideal party to have a conservative, to build a conservative army, as I call it, for the culture wars. And so there's literally a takeover of the Republican Party.
Die andere Frage, die ich habe, ist mir gestellt habe, warum ist die Abtreibungsfrage derart im Zentrum, dass man daran weiß, schwarz unterscheidet? Weil in der Bibel steht kein Wort für Abtreibung. Und Abtreibung wurde natürlich erst dann aktuell, was man sie machen kann, in der Zeit. Und da gibt es auch viele ethische Diskussionen und es ist ein ethisches Dilemma und es ist dann nicht so ganz klar. Also, wissen Sie, was ein Abtreibung so das kommen die amerikanischen Evangelikalen dazu, das zum Punkt zu machen.
Ja.
Die Entscheidung ist für alle. Die Todesstrafe für andere.
Yeah. When you mentioned black and white, and the issue of race, evangelicals have struggled from it. I love the Great Awakening, but I'm not an idealist with it. I'm critical of it because some of the great evangelists of that revival were pretty racist. And some supported slavery. George Whitefield who was a great Anglican preacher. This is before microphones. He could speak to crowds of thousands of people without amplification. His voice was that loud. And this guy loved Jesus with all his heart, but he used slave labor to build an orphanage in Virginia or in Georgia. You had Great Awakening theologians defending the subjugation of my people. You also had with indigenous people, Native Americans. You had early evangelicals who thought it was okay to take their land. And some of the evangelical missionaries who came over from Europe who loved Jesus with all their heart, they said, well, yeah, we know it's wrong that these things are happening, but at least, they're getting the gospel. So we colonized them so they can learn about Jesus. This was one of my struggles with being in the evangelical faith is I would hear people say, well, if it wasn't for slavery, your ancestors wouldn't have known Christ. And then later on, I find out that my family comes from Senegal and Mali and Gambia. And in Mali, there was a Christian community there long before Europeans got there. And you learn about the Coptic Church and of Egypt and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So it's all rubbish. But evangelicalism has had this problem, and the way that it swept these problems under the rug is through the gospel. It's turned the cross, as I say, into a broom to sweep away the issues. To say, well, it does, and you hear this from some evangelicals. Well, I don't care that you're Black and you're white, and there's these systemic issues that you have to deal with, and this white privilege. I don't care. All that matters is, people are dying and going to hell and need Jesus. They'll say this. We use our brotherhood in Christ, or sisterhood in Christ, or familyhood, or whatever in Christ, to ignore these realities. And now you're seeing evangelicalism in America pay the price for that.
Warum ist Abtreibung die primäre Zeitform? Der primäre Kampf, the primary battle until today?
The primary battle with race?
No.
What's the primary? Abortion. Oh yeah, abortion. Abortion. This is the thing. Abortion's like. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm getting to that point as well because and here's where it connects with race. Abortion is often the distraction that white evangelicals use to avoid dealing with this age-old issue of race. They'll say babies are being killed. And they'll look at the Black community and say, look at the statistics with abortion. Your community has high rates. You should care about that more than systemic racism, not understanding that the conditions that lead to abortion come from systemic racism. And the idea of being pro-life, this is where I call fellow evangelicals out and I say, pro-life, I said, you're not pro-life, you're pro-birth. Pro-life is that you don't just save a kid from getting aborted, you adopt that kid, you raise that kid, that child, you help them to grow up and to become a model citizen in society. You educate that child. You really give them a chance at life, and this is where, yeah. So with abortion, it's a distraction a lot of times from the issue of race. And I think a lot of evangelicals aren't pro-life, they're pro-birth. And it looks like a very noble cause, saving babies from death. So that cause stays at the center. And I think it's despicable and disgusting that the cause of abortion covers, it covers a multitude of sins. Yeah, we know that he said that the president said this about women. We know that he lies and he steals and this, but he's stopping abortions. Okay, but these other actions are still perpetuating the conditions that lead to abortion. Yes.
Und es ist immer schwer nachvollziehbar, dass relativ Trump die Grenze zwischen den Rassen ist, schwarz und weiß.
Mhm.
Also es sind dann so viele Schwarze nach den Zuschauerzahlen, dass sehr viele Spanier, also Hispanics, für Trump gewählt haben. Ist es nicht eine zu einfache Ausrede für die evangelikale Szene? Ist es wirklich so eine Rassentrennung, die so fest ins Gewicht fällt? Das ist eigentlich noch schwierig.
I didn't understand. My mind is in English. I'm sorry. I'm like, yeah.
Believe or to consider that it's really an issue about racism.
Yes.
That in the end, it's only the white evangelical who voted for Trump.
Mhm.
Isn't that not an easy way out for the evangelical scene? Because I also have friends, people of color, which are strong Trump supporters.
Yes.
There's a sponsored speaks who show that none of the Hispanics also
Yeah.
Voted for Trump. And also the Pentecost movement, I don't know, they are black and white as well. So
Yeah.
Mix.
Yeah.
It seems to me that they are also a very strong Trump supporters. So
Yes.
for me, it's also the article that for me, it was too easy answer.
Well, the thing is, it's a complex issue that you could spend days on, but the thing about it is the driving force, the main force behind Trumpism was white evangelicals. Evangelicals of color are a side piece of this. And I hold evangelicals of color just as guilty. But their reasons for supporting Trump are different than the reasons for white evangelicals. So here's one way that Trump, one good thing he did. His prison reform. I mean, despite his motivation for it, he did prison reform in an amazing, the most progressive prison reform compared to any other president. And in the debate he had with Joe Biden, he said, you know, you were in office for 8 years with the first black president, with Obama, and you're crying for prison reform and you did nothing. And he goes, within less than 4 years, look what I've done. And I'm like, well, he has a point. And this is the reason a lot of blacks, a lot of people from my community, mainly black men, supported Trump, because it was one of the first times that a president, in their eyes, had done something to reform the criminal justice system that treated them unfairly. And many people of color are sent to jail by judges in Democratic districts.